So, welcome to another session of the New York Information Security Meetup. I have the great pleasure to introduce Pete Morgan, who is the president and co-founder for Phylum. Thanks, Pete, for joining our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, it's really amazing. I've talked to many folks that are decided to kind of jump into the deep end and co-found or found companies and so on, and it's never easy. But before we jump into that, why don't we kind of dive a little bit deeper into your background, where you came from?
Cool. Yeah, so I came up in the security research and consulting side. Started writing software when I was a kid and was always really curious about how it worked. And after, actually before school, during and after, I was consulting, just doing kind of random one-off projects, and that turned into a career. And I joined a number of small boutiques, and then kind of got to Matasano back in the day. This is in 2007, 2008. And learned a lot there. Then went on to Accuvant and worked in their R&D group for a while. Ended up running that, and kind of learned all the skills I needed to run my own consulting operation. And then I started Clever Security in 2016, and did a bunch of really interesting work there. And then finally got to Phylum, and it's been a really interesting ride so far.
And then looking at your background, and it's really amazing because you can probably find a great position somewhere, because of your skill set. You have some brand name companies you work for, and security, really good security researchers and people that can communicate some of the findings to to the business owners are few and far between. They're hard to come by. What made you specifically kind of jump into the deep end and decide to again create your own, basically your own endeavor, and you jump into the deep end?
Yeah, a great question. It was kind of a combination of being really interested in how to build a startup, the kind of imagination of getting it off the ground day one, raising money, interacting with investors, getting the first customers. But then also, so that was an interest I've always had, really understanding the nuts and bolts of that. But recognizing that, in my opinion, our opinion, really, the defensive tools in the supply chain space were just completely inadequate. We were watching how, as we dug into this problem domain, we're kind of afflicted by this view of operating like attackers. That's really all I've been doing for my entire life, is trying to figure out how attackers would break into this thing. So I had to be one. And when I look at it from that lens, it's just such an attractive target. Spent some time doing quite a bit of low-level vulnerability research on, operating systems, mobile devices, browsers, file formats, everything, and understanding how that entire market for capability development on those major targets has gotten really, really complex and very expensive. For an attacker to go after those kinds of targets, you have to have pretty serious investment. Now, to go after the supply chain, you need none of those things. It is comparatively a lot easier. It's not well defended, and there's not a lot of money being put into defending that kind of that part of the ecosystem. So it's just such a ripe target for attackers that we know that this is happening out from under us right now, and that's why we had to decided to stop and build Phylum right away.
Yeah, and I love that. And it's typically what I've seen in most successful businesses are ones that the founders came across a gap, throughout their career, somewhere that they were working on, and they figure out, okay, there's nothing out there that really answers that, and they decided to go ahead and create. And again, this is something that I've seen over and over again. But before we jump into that, and we'll definitely dive into the kind of the technology and the kind of the why and how and so on. What strikes me is that you were, you're very technical, obviously, security researcher, and then you kind of pivoted into, running your own business, and now you're an evangelist. You have to go out in front of potential clients, and you're smiling because you know where I'm going with this. It's like, how did you, did you do on the job training to be able to go and kind of pivot into a kind of more of a sales role, but driving the business, which is it's not trivial.
Yeah, that was something I never knew I would enjoy. Um, I like when you think about your identity and like what you value about yourself. I always really valued technical acumen and learning and developing in that regard, and I still do. That hasn't changed. But in some previous roles, I had kind of risen up through ranks and was running some teams, and some management changed, and there was a decree that if you can't make this amount of money as a business, we're going to disband the team. So I had to learn how to do sales, and I never think of myself as like a great salesperson by any stretch of the imagination, but I like people. I like interacting with people. I like solving problems for customers, and I have a pretty deep technical acumen to really understand the right way to solve one of these problems. So that really kind of came together in working out pretty well, both on the consulting side and then in some product roles as well. And hopefully it works out well at Phylum as well.
I'm sure it will. So, do you find that your technical background in the experience that you had doing this on the other side of the kind of the defense helps you in understanding what the kind of the business problems that the customer are facing?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a double-edged sword because um, sometimes we see security issues and then very quickly figure out technical solutions for solving them in like the somewhat of an ideal case, and it can be sometimes tough to forget that and remember that that doesn't matter unless it maps to what the customer can and will do. So a lot of times it's going into a customer and figuring out how do they see the problem, what are the challenges internal to their organization, and how can you help them. Maybe you can't remediate it totally, but how can you help them mitigate it, and basically come up with a solution that moves them forward as much as possible with as little churn, even if it's not ideal. It's just a reality that I think it is a lot more blinding to me now that um, you know completely architecting a really cool technical solution that plugs all the holes and solves everything, which isn't realistic to begin with. But even if you could, you have to get into the customer and it has to work the way they want it to, or the way their organization or culture depends on. If it doesn't, it's meaningless. And that's one of the artifacts I think that's particularly interesting. But I always enjoy going into a customer, pretty prepared because we've spent, we've spent 30 years thinking about software, and that helps. Frankly, I'm very impressed by salespeople that are able to do so well that don't have that background. I don't know how they do it because that's the thing I rely on most, I think.
I think some of them fake it until the kind of they make it. I mean that's the key, and I think there's a movement to become more of a consultative type of sale as opposed to transactional, and you see that a lot. I think we're going to have the low end kind of a sales transaction are all going to be happening online, and then the high end consultative sales, like in your particular case where you're solving a very difficult complex issue, but you have the technical acumen to support what you're saying, and what that will be kind of the leading sales transaction in the future, and then all the middle stuff will also kind of disappear eventually. And you probably kind of back me up on that.
Yeah, I think uh, like I've witnessed some salespeople that weren't technical that were incredible. But they were really really good at understanding the customer. I think that was like one of the skills they really showed. But I agree. I think that um, if we can't really understand what the customer's problems are, like you can't just try to bring things in and do this stitch patchwork quilt to try to fix everything. I think the kind of bottoms up market, the product led growth, where you can try out a product really quickly in a rapid free trial, where fits into gives you some hands on with it, is going to eat up a lot of the kind of middle ground that you're mentioning. And there will always be some transactional sales to some degree, but I think most organizations are going to work to try to be consultative on that because it just everything goes better. I've had a few relationships over the years where I've got to work with organizations for over a decade, and when something happens that they're not sure about, my phone rings, and even if it's not, most of the time now it's not related to Phylum, but that's okay. Like we've had a long-standing relationship for a long time, and if I can help in an hour, that'll come back eventually. It's both myself and the customer value that kind of interaction, and I think it's just an inevitability. It has to go there.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. So, do you recall like the first couple times that you met with a customer as kind of the evangelist, the co-founder, and what was that like? Because I'm assuming that you were doing a bit of an MVP, minimum viable product at a time, and they say if you're proud of it, it's too late to be released. You're supposed to have a little bit of shame in it. So, do you remember
Right.
how that looked like?
Yes, definitely. It was. I remain very flattered by the customers that have been interested in working with us already. We set up some design partnerships with a number of organizations early on in Phylum, and you know, at the time, I look back on it and think we saw a technical problem and we built a technical solution to the problem. We did not build a product, and then when we brought it into those design partnerships, we really started to see how they would use it. And now I look back and it's hindsight's 2020, and it seems obvious, but it's stuff we didn't know at the time, and that was so helpful in actually turning a technical solution into a product to be used like a product for organizations. And there's I think especially in infosec, you have to be ready for someone to be smarter than you in the room, and hopefully you run into it regularly. So the whole concept of like ego really doesn't map well here, because there is someone somewhere in the world who has spent 1,000 hours on a target that maybe you've only looked at for like 10, or dug into an area deeper. And if you run into them, they can school you on some things, which is great. It's one of the best things about this industry. But the idea of holding ego in these conversations is just, I think, antithetical. And I've definitely left some meetings with my tail between my legs because we overlook some things, but that type of insight is super valuable because we're able to go back and fix it and improve. And we're going to continue doing that for a while. I'm sure it's still going to happen tomorrow and the day after that, but that's kind of an ethos that we're not really worried about. That kind of feedback is going to guide the product to be better and more applicative to customer use, and those are all great things.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's important to be humble, right? It's something you learn, as you mentioned, being schooled by potential clients that
Yeah,
probably know more than you, and it's tough because they do it full time as much as you do, right? So,
right.
um, so how do you talk about design partners, and I have so many questions, right? Just coming up from what you just answered. So, how does design partnership work, and then how do you again as the co-founder decide, again you have limited resources in terms of what you're developing, limited numbers of developers and so on, and you mentioned that you wanted to move into a product as opposed to like features or um, how do you decide what's important? Because again a customer can tell you, okay, this is what I want, but how will you
Right.
decide if that's like what other 10 customers would want as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's an element of with the design partners you can there's a set of design partners you can select for. You're like be hopeful for, and then hopefully some amount of them will actually work with you and contribute time to that effort. Like I said, we were really flattered by the group that we were able to work with, um, and most of them, almost all of them, I think, really have pretty mature application security programs where they see, we brought up these problems to them. They saw through it really quickly. They had been thinking about it themselves. They had some really good ideas about how to do it. But that input, so that's incredibly valuable. But I think you have to really have a kind of a shining star, a northern star in your mind of what needs to happen in order to build something like this, build a product that solves these kind of challenges. It's a long path, and we have a roadmap for a long time built out to really solve the supply chain security problems. But we have a really good idea on how to go do that. And I think we'll run into more situations where someone will try to convince us differently. We definitely already have. But ultimately, we drive our understanding of that from how attackers operate. And because we have a really good idea of that, I'm confident that our solution is going to be extremely effective at it.
Yeah. So, it's funny when you tell somebody that you do supply chain security, right? That depending who you talk to means different things to different people.
Yeah.
So I would love to get your definition of supply chain security, specifically around software supply chain, right? And where does Phylum fit into that, and what are kind of the main pain point that you solve, for customers?
Sure. Yeah. So supply chain security, I don't think this was a real term until this year.
Correct.
It's something we were talking about last year. It kind of didn't work out that well when we were having early conversations. And then some things like SolarWinds and dependency confusion and repo jacking all came out this year, and that really allowed us to use that term more regularly because it fits better what we're doing. There's this like software composition analysis space that's been around for a long time, but I think that was, there's been limited innovation in that area. And when I think about supply chain security, I think about a gigantic area. Like this is going to end up being an entirely different MITRE ATT&CK framework. If you think about like that kind of structure, there's going to be a brand new one built just for supply chain security because it's necessary. And there's a lot of different spots that need to be dealt with in order to solve this. But we're pretty early, or near the front of that kind of hypothetical attack matrix, right? Mm-hmm. We look at things from the perspective of open source software being used by individuals, organizations to build their software. And there's a study that came out, I think, last year that for a given software project written by an organization, that organization's developers write on average about 30% of the total code. About 70% of it comes from dependencies that are imported by a package manager or programming language dependencies they're using, so libraries of some kind. And one of the things that I think is so crucial, and one of the things we really focus on, is code provenance. Where does this code come from? Who touches it along the way? How does it change? And how can we start understanding that from a risk perspective? Because when you see the amount of software that's being built at the speed it's being built, and then understand all of this is being driven by this massive push in automation, what ends up happening is people are relying on code written by a random person from the internet that they don't know. They have no ability to referee what their intents or goals are. And they're using that code in a way where as updates happen to it, they often get pulled in automatically, which that means that code is by definition untrusted. Because as that author makes changes, that can filter through these dependencies in these automated environments. Now, that may not be terrible for like one or two or three dependencies, but when you look at the actual chain, you see a pretty stark picture. There are millions and millions of these dependencies, and they're changing out from under us constantly, every day. So the idea that we're going to be able to stay on top of this without some sort of automation is unfortunately just not realistic. And where that code comes from, how it evolves, how it changes, and then how that risk perspective can be managed to defend software from attackers is kind of the biggest part of the problem for us right now.
So first of all, there's a couple of things that kind of, again, to float from what you just mentioned is, first of all, the numbers are staggering. So you're telling me that 70% of the code is being reused. That's significant. It's not like, and then the speed of which software is developed, because again, it's all about going to market fast, right?
Right.
And software is dynamic. It's not like you build a product and it's done. It's you continuously add and massage it and add features and benefits and so on. So that's everything is evolving, and so where have we been up until now? Let's say if you're not a Phylum customer, what do you do? Are you aware of these gaps and the security and the software, the way the software has been developed, or do you do anything about it today?
So there are definitely other products that are um, working on parts of this problem. The majority that I've seen tend to focus on software vulnerabilities, and that being, if I'm using package A version B, and I ask about this package, tell me about the vulnerabilities, and there's kind of like a database, right, of known things, and they'll look that up in the database and tell you if there's any vulnerabilities in that package version. And that's an important part, but there's a much deeper part to the supply chain security question. Again, where is what kind of code is actually coming in? Who wrote it? How did it evolve? How did that change? What are some artifacts about those authors that we can start tracking? Is this package does this package have a single author, a single maintainer? Where if that maintainer kind of gives up on that package, it kind of just stales out the entire chain behind it. And what other behaviors can we detect from this author? Is it someone who regularly commits software vulnerabilities? Are they committing malicious elements to other repositories? One of the advantages here is that, with open source code, all of this stuff is just on the internet. And in most cases, you can see the full commit history for a given repository. So you can see how it started and evolved over time. You just have to be able to analyze that and do so at speed, because there's hundreds of millions of them, right?
So you basically what you do, and again, just talk about a bit of a layman's term here. You review these open source repositories, and you're building a kind of a database and of the changes and who owns it and the history of the code, so you can better understand the origins and the kind of the whereabouts and the history of it, so you can detect anomalies, or you can find out whether a package artifact is more risky than others, and potentially alert on that prior to being used. Is that a correct statement?
That's very close. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
We pull in all this software, we basically dissect it, and then as that's kind of structured, we pull in every bit we possibly can about these different packages. And if we found out tomorrow there was something we had overlooked, or there's something new, we pull that in too. We structure all that information and then build analytics, heuristics, and machine learning models on top of it to take the data, produce evidence from it, and then basically stitch these low indicators of risk together to identify high risk indicators. There are some cases like in this ecosystem where something is just objectively terrible. Maybe like a critical RCE, a remote code execution bug, or an active piece of malware, right? There's no rocket science. If you can detect that, it's terrible.
Yeah,
But
it's almost like a continuum, right? You're talking about the fact that this is the horrible side, like right here, but I'm assuming that the majority of software falls in somewhere in between.
exactly. And that's where you have to think about it from a risk perspective. Um, in a lot of cases, we've seen kind of vulnerability scanners that then tried to do more. But when you see things from the lens of a vulnerability scanner, it's kind of a binary classification. Something either has a vulnerability or it doesn't. But when you have to build something that tries to analyze a risk model, because we actually use this to develop what we call the Phylum package score, it's kind of like a credit score for packages. As things are well done in a package or in a repository, the score goes up. As things aren't, the score goes down. And we use that to try to create a reputation score to help customers referee about what type of software they should be using, what should they be worried about, what do they need to act on today, and what they might be able to be tabled for a little bit later. And one great example that I think is this concept of like abandonware. So if you imagine like a developer works at a company and they start building an open source piece of software because they need it at their job, and everyone else really likes it and they start using it. But then that developer gets a new job where they no longer need to work on that software. If they don't touch it, that just ends up becoming stale. And it turns out when you figure out how to identify abandonware, um, you're set with the reality that the majority of open source code is actually abandoned. Now, that's not an issue by itself. It becomes an issue when you find something else that may be a security issue. So maybe there's a vulnerability found in that package, or maybe one of the packages it depends on has a new committer that's known to be malicious and is making updates that may flow into that package. When you pair up abandonware with another security critical element, it amounts to a risk that is significantly higher because the author probably isn't paying attention to it. You can really easily deduce that. But it takes a lot of fine tuning to kind of take all that data and put it together in a way that is both actionable and maintains a signal to noise ratio for the customer, where you're not alerting them about every single package they're using, because it would just be like trying to drink from a fire hose at that point.
And speaking of a fire hose, I mean, we're talking about, this is a massive endeavor that's continued. I mean, how many lines of codes are being written on a daily basis? What are we talking about here in terms of monitoring?
I mean,
A lot.
no idea, but it would be staggering. I can promise you that. It's we're looking at millions and millions of packages a day, and we're only we're a year and a half, almost a year and a half old, not quite. And there's a lot more ecosystems we got to break into to really solve this problem. And the one artifact that I thought was most interesting was looking at the derivative of change for these packages. In several of the most popular programming language ecosystems, the rate at which new packages are added is accelerating day to day. So it's not just more software being produced, the rate that the software is being produced is increasing. And that means, like, whatever the problem is today, it's going to get worse. We haven't solved how to make developers write, more secure code. It's kind of an artifact that is everyone's working toward, but we're definitely not there yet. So by definition, having more software means we have to have an ability to look at it more rapidly. And that's part of the reason why we approach this from the purely automation perspective, is trying to figure out ways to teach a system to look at something as rapidly as possible and start identifying small risk indicators that we can put together to see bigger patterns. And it's been a challenge, but it's been really fun.
And that leads me to the next question. So you are, reviewing these massive amount of repository on a regular basis. And I'm assuming, again, there's machine learning involved in trying to develop some algorithms, again, all about automation and how to predict that. Would you be able to, become almost like a minority report for code, knowing that the code is going to be bad even before it's being written, just because of the history of that particular package?
That is a goal of ours. I think there's a little bit of, a ... in between that state where we are today. But when I think about how, if I was trying to attack something in the open source ecosystem, I wouldn't want to just, try to put all my code in one commit and then try to get that commit approved into a package. I might put a small bit or a small piece in one package and then find another dependency in a different spot in the chain and try to add another piece, and basically build up a number of these commits to actually lead to a conclusion where I could actually attack something. And that's exactly what I think will be detectable, to your point about like that minority report vision, right? When you can start watching actors that are slowly or trying to be careful about influencing the software supply chain, you can start seeing patterns for how that's done. When you think about, let's take malware, for instance, right now. When you're trying to write a piece of malware, there's only a limited set of things you're really trying to do with malware. You're trying to execute code of some kind. You're trying to exfil data of some kind. There's a set of functions that really there's not that many. There's probably a few hundred things that you might try to accomplish. And if you can defend against those really well, you can make it a much harder target for malware authors to try to influence. And that's really what we're trying to do, right? Like we're not solving the satisfiability problem. We're not trying to, you know, automatically reason bundle code, but we're trying to make this sufficiently difficult that attackers move on to other things. So everyone can keep using open source and building products the way they are, and building new things in a way that's a lot more safe from where it stands today.
And what about developing almost like a fingerprint? I'm assuming that some of these, malware writers and people that are trying to influence the code, whether they're state sponsored or not, leave almost like they have their own attributes, almost like a fingerprint on the code. Have you developed a way to figure out where, potentially just because we've seen that before, and where potentially where it originated from, and then knowing that the code can be potentially malicious that way?
That's something we're working on as well. You can see this in kind of the APT reports for when like AV or security research companies find a new piece of malware, they'll reverse engineer it and try to find marks that can lead them to conclusions that these are tied to different threat actors. And that can be artifacts of code for how they write things or how they reuse different components. And in source code, that's something that's particularly interesting because it's something that we're expecting to find actors that are trying to kind of clean that of watermarks. But to some degree, there's only a certain set of things, again, that you're trying to do, and a finite amount of ways to do that. So there inevitably are patterns in how things are built and how they're used, or even how they're put together, that can draw some conclusions. Now, I think there's, on the other side of it, the nation state actors are definitely spending a lot of money and a lot of time to try to avoid that identification, right? But it's something where, definitely compared to where things are today, a huge amount of work can be done to improve the state of the art, and hopefully like make this something that just isn't worth those attackers going after anymore.
Just letting the audience know, this conversation is completely unscripted. Peter doesn't have the questions up front. He's doing a great job. Me tackling him with the some of these specific questions about technology. And it seems like you have a lot of this on the roadmap, and I don't know if it's really fantastic, and it's so critical because everything is software today, right? We're from wearables to the watches to industrial devices to aviation. I mean, it's all software. I mean, it's we're moving to a knowledge-based economy, that we already are a knowledge-based economy, and everything is being automated and consumed that way. So how does one talk about consumption? How does one deploy the solution? Where does it fit in the organization? And how in actuality, what does the kind of this solution does for your customers?
Sure. So today we built this to be as flexible as possible. In our design partnerships and early conversations with customers, we've never come across two that have the exact same kind of developer/build environment. Lots of people are using CI/CD systems, and I think a lot more are going toward that, and it's great. We have the ability to run tests and security tools automatically behind the scenes, just using a bunch of compute power. That's fantastic. We all should do that. So whenever possible, we try to integrate to run as often as we possibly can, to review the changes that happened to a given project's package dependencies, to help customers stay in front of anything that may have changed since the last time they looked at this, right? This isn't something you want to do like quarterly or even monthly. This is something you want constant eyes on as much as possible. So we plug into a shell script, a CI/CD system, a build automation of really any kind. We built it to be incredibly flexible. And all we look at is the package dependencies today. And our system is constantly going through that data and updating our reputation scores and our package scores to provide the most up-to-date information we can and the most actionable issues that need to be resolved so customers can come in, look at the problems they may need to address, understand them, and then go back to what they were doing. We're very aware that this is kind of a much, much deeper well than I think most people originally thought it was. And if we just generate a giant queue of work that needs to get done, it's going to be tough for customers to adopt. So we're really trying to prioritize and focus on the things that are actionable and maintain the signal to noise ratio such that it's not overwhelming. And this isn't something where people are going to throw their hands up and say, it's just too much work. It's not worth doing right now. Because it's, like I said, just in the last 5 years, this has changed so much. If we look at, there's a stat I remember there, if you look at like JavaScript's package manager, NPM, in 2015, it had like 12,000 packages. Today, it's over 1.7 million and growing at like, I don't know, 1,100, 1,500 a day. Just in the last, blink of an eye, this has changed drastically. Mm-hmm. And we've seen the elements of this continue to change. So we have to kind of stay on top of this. So we've made this to be as easy to integrate as possible, super lightweight, responds really quickly, because we built this massive automation system that's constantly pruning all that open source code. And these packages, the repositories, the authors, how they link 24/7, trying to update the information. So the next time you run a build or a test, we can inform you if there's something you need to worry about. And that extends even forward to kind of protecting developers. When you start thinking about, say you're running you're using Phylum and you identify, we identify that there's a piece of malware in one of the dependency chains that you're relying on. It's great to stop that at the test phase, but in all likelihood, at least one of the developers has been compromised by that, because a lot of these types of malicious parts will run as a post-install step or during the installation of packages that typically happens on developer workstations before it gets to build infrastructure. So you still have a malware IR incident response to go deal with. And we're trying to get in front of that and basically help police that even before it gets to a developer's workstation.
Speaking about developers, I mean, we're, a lot of times, the way software is being built today is, it's a gig-based economy. You may have a couple of developers. Again, you're smiling because you know where I'm going with this, right? So you have gig-based economy where you may have these dispersed developers working on a same project, or software development house that, again, very dispersed as well. How do you then deal with that, particularly for these type of developers to access your system?
That's, for us, that's no problem at all. We're really easy to drop into any of those environments. We made it to be literally as flexible as possible for that. I think those types of situations with the gig economy of development and using kind of outsourced teams is going to have some challenges, because it's just human nature to have patterns of behavior, right? And when you learn how to solve a problem in a certain way, it can be very tough to unlearn that if you need to, especially if you don't know you need to unlearn that. So applying the same kind of code paradigms over and over and over in different types of projects or for different customers is not necessarily a bad thing, unless something is known to be bad about that code paradigm. And oftentimes you don't find out about it till later. So trying to figure out the pollution of how one element may have affected multiple people is not dissimilar to how we look at code at the library level. One of the things we're very excited and working on, like literally right now, is trying to identify where vulnerable Stack Overflow responses have polluted open source packages, just to get a glimpse of the reality of it. I think if you ask a lot of software developers, it's a pretty widely held conclusion that happens. People take Stack Overflow responses and they just use them in their code because it makes things work. And there are side effects to that. And we're very interested to be going to look at what are those side effects, how widespread are they, and what conclusions can we draw from seeing that just in the open source world, and then hopefully extrapolating that to things that customers can use about their own code and improving that kind of thing.
I love that you obviously have a vision of where you're going with this, and this is it's a big problem to solve, and big problems to solve are are ones that you want to go after.
Right.
So absolutely. So, what's the best way to reach you if somebody is listening to this and wanted to give it a try?
Sure. You can go to the website, phylum.io. You can email me, pete@phylum.io, and I'd love to hear from you. Um, we're a relatively small team right now, but we're really trying to be as focused on customers as possible. And there'll be a lot more. We're putting a lot of content on our blog. We just had our data scientist just put up a new article on, I think is really, really particularly neat. It's just a single layer, but it's one of the elements we use for informing how we look at authors. And he just had a cool question about if I can we detect any sort of anomalous activity based on the time of commit for a given author? And it turns out you can. It's not the only thing you need to do, but it's one element that you can start using to track what is an author's normal behavior and when does that diverge? And what are the things can we now find based on that divergence? Is there a good reason for that? Or maybe this is something that will lead to identifying when credential stuffing or password reuse attacks were happening against that developer. There's some interesting stuff that comes out of it, but a lot of cool stuff on the blog right now.
Yeah, totally. It sounds like a really cool PhD thesis as well.
Yeah,
Pete, thank you very much for joining the session today. Much appreciated. Thanks all for joining. Looking forward to keep track of what you guys are doing and developing. It sounds like a exciting project. And maybe we'll do this again, and hopefully you can come to New York City and take part in one of the in-person events we're hosting.
that'd be fantastic. Thanks so much for having me, David.
Thank you again. Much appreciated.